it filled me with this sense that everything in the universe is alive or carries this lifelike energy or consciousness, what I later started to term as consciousness, or an intelligence, or a benevolence even. So it was as though everything around me was breathing this new life energy, was permeating this new life energy. But rather than it feeling like something that I had acquired, it felt as though this intelligence or this consciousness was always there all around me the whole time, but that I had been blinded to it until that very moment in time. So it felt as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes and I could finally see what was already there in front of me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mind the Shift. I am Anders Bolling. My guest today is Jessica Corneille. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi. Well, thank you.
Hope I pronounced your last name correctly there. It's French, isn't it?
Yeah. Corneille, but Corneille is great.
Yeah. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you because you're doing some deep digging into the border area between science and spirituality. And that's an area which is right at the core of what this podcast, this YouTube channel is all about. And there is a very personal reason why you began doing that. So that we will come back to, of course. And I'm very excited to hear more about that. And we're not really old friends, but we are acquaintances because we are connected. I mean, myself through something called the Frontier Journalist Network, and which is loosely connected to something called the Galileo Commission, where you are engaged, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, let me just first here to introduce you to the audience here, read what I've found about your current research and work when I've been looking you up on the internet. You are a research psychologist specialized in spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences and altered states of consciousness. You have a master's degree in psychology from the University of Greenwich. With a passion to bridge the worlds of science and spirituality, your mission is to challenge the default pathologization of awakening experiences, to look beyond the current designated spectrum of quote-unquote normality. You work for the Scientific and Medical Network and the Galileo Commission. You're a collaborator of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, that was a difficult one, and Spiritual Crisis Network. And you're also a certified Kundalini yoga teacher. Did I get everything right there?
Everything's great.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, but your story is even more fascinating because this research of yours began with a profound personal spontaneous spiritual awakening almost 7 years ago. So let us begin there. What was it that happened with your existence, one might say, back in February of 2016?
I never know how to start telling this story because it's something that really profoundly changed my life in every aspect. And so to narrow it down to a few words often feels like I'm doing it injustice, but I'm going to try my very best.
Take your time.
I mean, I've told the story so many times before, but it's just, it's a tricky one. But basically, on February the 19th, 2016, I went to bed and I fell asleep. And the next morning when I woke up, I opened my eyes and I was flooded with this immense sense of well-being, of connection with everything and everyone in the universe, and this deep sense of oneness. And it was an experience that was a deeply lived experience. It was a deeply felt experience. It was almost cellular or vibrational. And it filled me with this sense that everything in the universe is alive or carries this lifelike energy or consciousness, what I later started to term as consciousness, or an intelligence, or a benevolence even. So it was as though everything around me was breathing this new life energy was permeating, this new life energy. But rather than it feeling like something that I had acquired, it felt as though this intelligence or this consciousness was always there all around me the whole time, but that I had been blinded to it until that very moment in time. So it felt as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes and I could finally see what was already there in front of me. And this feeling stayed with me for many, many months. And then it sort of started to wane into my everyday existence. So it started to integrate into my everyday existence. And by such, it started to wane in some ways. But the intensity of the experience lasted for many months. And it's still with me now because it completely transformed every aspect of my being and of my life. So I don't know if you want to intervene with some questions here, because I could talk about it for an infinite amount of time.
Yeah, I have so many questions around this experience and what shifted within you, because maybe we can start with asking about what you just said here. How much of this has actually stayed with you during all these years? I mean, it's difficult, I guess, to talk about percentages or something like that. But I mean, what aspects of it are still with you in your day-to-day life, and how has that changed your way of living your day-to-day life, and how has it affected the people around you, and how you interact with people around you? There was actually 3 questions, I think.
So 6 years down the line, and I'm still thinking about it all the time. You know, I'm constantly questioning what happened to me that morning when I woke up on February the 20th, 2016. So it's something that very directly is still with me, because it's something that is just so present in my life every day. I think about it. My work is now based on trying to understand these types of experiences better. So the experience led me to want to pursue a scientific career in this, in order to better understand the underpinnings of these kinds of experiences on a neurobiological basis, but also on a psychological basis. That's not to narrow down the experience to a set of neuronal activities or whatever. It's more just to try and understand from that perspective, from the more scientific perspective, what is going on, in order to sort of shed light on these experiences and raise awareness within mainstream psychology that these experiences exist and that they can be deeply beneficial to humanity. So yeah, shifted my way of just thinking about life, shifted my career path. It shifted my perception of life. So now I'm much more able to both go within a sort of set of experiences in life, and I'm much more curious about things. I'm able to see things on a micro scale, but also I'm also able to take myself out of certain situations and see things in a bigger picture. And that's really something that shifted from before. Because whilst before my experience, I wasn't, in any sort of depressive state or anything like that, but I was much more volatile, in the sense that, emotionally volatile. I could be very easily influenced emotionally by the things that were happening around me. But since my experience is much more able to gain a sense of perspective around the problems maybe that I would encounter, that I encounter now. And it's just made me so much more understanding towards those around me, around people's behaviors, and also towards my own behaviors. So I'm a lot more forgiving to myself, a lot more forgiving towards others. I've acquired a new sense of gratitude towards life. And I mean, it really has shifted my life in so many different ways that it's almost impossible to describe in how many ways.
Well, maybe if we get a little bit concrete here, I've spoken to some people who are into the non-duality thing, and especially I've had 2 interviews. I've done 2 interviews with a man called Angelo Di Lullo, who is now a kind of a spiritual teacher or a spiritual pointer working with that. But he's also a doctor in Colorado. Very interesting person. You should check him out. He has a website called Simply Always Awake, and he talks a lot about this feature that you that there is no separation, which is very, very strange for people who are not awake to understand what that is. But I mean, basically, it means that you don't experience that there is any separation between not between like you and me, like between human beings, but between me and anything else. Actually, I mean, it's like the blade of grass close to me feels just as close as the moon and the stars, if you see what I mean. Is that something that some kind of experience that was that part of your experience back then, and is it perhaps still with you in any sense?
Absolutely, well explained. Again, it's very hard to use language to describe these experiences because they're ineffable by their very nature, i.e. there are no words to describe them, but you've described it very well. That's the thing. I mean, it's not just a sense of intellectual understanding that we are not separated, because essentially when you think about about our position on this earth and also our position within the greater universe, you can conceptualize, you can understand that we are all connected and that there is no separation, so to speak. But these experiences, the experience of non-duality, of enlightenment, really brings you to that sense of non-separation. You feel that sense of connection, of intimate connection with everything and everyone in the universe, in a very embodied way, rather than a thought way or a theorized or an intellectual way. It's almost like returning to your true nature, your true spiritual nature, because at the essence of all of this is a sort of spiritual connection or a deeper sense of consciousness. So yeah, it's that essentially that's what it is. But
and you mentioned before that it was it was a little bit like remembrance, that you kind of, how could I forget this? This is the way it is, of course. And did you also then recall how it felt when you were a young child? Because some people say that it's almost as if you're back to the ages of 2, 3, 4, when everything's just magical. There is no separation. Did you recall that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't recall my own childhood. It's not like I thought, oh wow, this reminds me of my childhood. But it was a sense that I was returning to the childlike state, because even things like the colors around me were extremely vivid in those months following the experience. The sounds, smells, touch, everything was amplified to a degree that it's just beyond anything I've ever experienced, So even just from a perceptual five senses kind of standpoint, everything was as though everything was new. There was a newness to everything, and yet by contradiction, it was as though everything was already there the whole time, and that I had been blinded to, and that the veil had been lifted, or I was remembering what was already there. So there's this contrast between there's an old wisdom that you're remembering, but that it feels like there's this newness all around you, and that you're feeling things for the first time. It's like feeling first life, it's really going back to the source. And what's very interesting as well that I didn't mention is that there's an immense sense of bliss that was accompanied by a sense of loss of fear. There was no more fear in that state. And very, very interestingly, even though my experience did not occur through a near-death experience, but I had a very strong sense that all would be well after my death or during my death. Yeah. So it was because it felt like that was the homecoming, that was the return to the source, and that was where we were going to go. That's where we're all going to go when we die.
It's so fascinating because you didn't have any religious background. You were kind of fairly, as far as I understand, physicalist in your approach to life. So you didn't have any connections to these kinds of spiritual approaches, did you?
No, not at all. I was an atheist growing up and had been an atheist up until that morning when I woke up. So during that night, something happened and I don't know what it was. I mean, I had a very intense lucid dream, but that's just my experience, what I experienced, but I don't know what actually triggered me to have this, very, very profound mystical experience. And it doesn't matter, because essentially what matters is how it changed me, how it made me a much more empathetic and loving person. And that's why I feel so strongly that, if we could just understand these experiences better scientifically, then we would be able to make a case for them to not always be considered a psychopathology or a mental health disorder within mainstream psychological systems as they are presently, unfortunately. So anybody really who presents themselves with these kinds of symptoms to a psychologist or psychiatrist will usually be diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And in my opinion, and in the opinions of all those who I interviewed and who I've spoken to since, who have had similar type experiences, they say that it was, the most beautiful experience of their life. It transformed them for the better, and that it actually enabled them to release themselves from a lot of the depression that they might have had carried with them before, or the anxieties that they might have experienced. And I've even spoken to individuals who have experienced a spontaneous release from addiction after their experience of awakening. And there are cases of individuals who feel less inclined to want to commit suicide after an experience of the such. So we need to reframe these experiences,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I definitely want to know more about your research and work, of course, but I'm not quite done with your personal experience just yet. And they go together, of course. What about time? Did you, or do you perhaps experience timelessness? Because that's also it's all connected to the loss of fear and the loss of duality and all that. But time is kind of, when we live in this three-dimensional reality, we kind of experience time as something that actually exists, and we live our lives so much in the future, which hasn't happened yet, and in the past, which which doesn't exist anymore. Like we're in shackles, between these two, and we're not really living. So, how, if you think about and memories is a strange thing as well. If you think about yourself, the Jessica before the awakening and the Jessica today, how do those memories appear to you, and how does time appear to you after this experience?
That's a really good question that nobody's ever asked me. I can now, 6 years after my experience, think back on my experience and sort of place it in time and space. But at the time, in the moment that I had my experience, I had a complete loss of time, not space, because I was still very much aware of where I was, but I had an immense loss of time. I don't actually know. I know what I did that day, but I don't know the timings of what I did. For example, I'll give you an example. I had this incredible sense of gratitude, and I knelt down on the bed and I cried. But it feels like I cried for hours, but I think it was probably just minutes or just a few minutes, because time and space just completely shifted in that moment.
Do you know if it was minutes or hours? Do you have any?
I don't know if it was hours, but it could have been either, and I don't know. And in that moment, I didn't have a clue. I was so engrossed in the present. The experience really propelled me to live in the present. That's another way that it's changed me. But very much so, especially in the first few weeks and the first few months, I was just in this constant state of presence where I was not even thinking about the past, not considering the future. I was just at that intersection between past and future, living this sense of presence. And I was able to recall everything so vividly through, like, even though I wasn't living in a state of past, I could recall everything from the moment that I had my experience to the moment that I was thinking about it with such clarity. And everything that came before the experience was a bit less clear. So it kind of enhanced my cognitive abilities in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I wasn't living in the state of the past, which was really significant, because, like you say, most people are just, a slave to the past or a slave to the future. And yeah, so.
But what about your identity then? Your sense of Jessica Corneille? Did it disappear in a way that it was strange to you to think that, oh, am I this Jessica Corneille with this? You have these vague memories of a person doing a lot of things for 23 years or whatever, and did it appear as something very odd that should be you?
No,
you understand my question?
It felt like I had been. It felt realer than real, and it felt as though that was the Jessica Corneille that I had forgotten in many ways. Myself that I had forgotten. So I wasn't thinking about it like that, but of course I was in awe, and I was extremely I was in extreme shock actually that I was having this experience, even though it was a beautiful experience, it was blissful, but it was still a shock. It was still something that I could not have considered ever having, especially as I wasn't at all involved in anything spiritual or religious before the experience. So yeah, it was still shocking. But
no, that's very interesting that it happened that spontaneously. I think the most famous spontaneous spiritual awakening that exists today, I mean, there are several, but it's probably the one that Eckhart Tolle had. You know Eckhart Tolle, with his very famous spiritual teacher and lecturer today, and has written these books about this, and he had this awakening when he was, I think, 28 to 29 years old or so. But at that point, he was, I mean, his psyche was on the brink of collapse. I think he was almost, on the brink of taking his own life or something like that. He was very, very, very depressed. So it wasn't you can point to a certain circumstance that made him have this spiritual spontaneous awakening. But in your case, there was nothing like that, was it? I mean, it's just, you just had this dream, and you were in Spain, were you? Or
I had just moved countries, so maybe that was a primer to me having an experience. I mean, I don't know for what reason, but I suppose when you change environments, it's like people who go on retreats, they're more likely to have spiritually transformative experiences, perhaps. That hasn't been scientifically proven, but it's so evident through anecdotal sort of. But yeah, no, I mean,
have you pondered why you, and why at this particular time? Have you pondered that and come to any conclusion?
But I've pondered it, but there's no real reason, there's no real trigger for it to have occurred. And I wasn't depressed at all before my experience. I was extremely happy. Because I had just moved to Madrid a month before. I hadn't made new friends. I was, working in a dream job, which I then decided to quit because I actually wanted to pursue a career in psychology. But I was working in the preservation of cultural heritage and in art production, and I was having the most exciting experiences of my life. Meeting lots of really cool people, and so it wasn't as though I was, experiencing an ego death because I was having a really negative psychological experience.
Almost the opposite, actually, sounds like.
Yeah, pretty much the opposite. Again, I've had many very happy moments in my life, thankfully. So that also wasn't an outlier, the sort of sense of happiness and joy. But of course, I was in an even more exciting period of my life. So yes, I suppose it could be considered the opposite. But yeah, I mean, and I hadn't, I've had a very good upbringing. I've had a very happy upbringing. I mean, of course, we all have our ups and downs. We all have our issues, our family issues, but I wasn't in a depressive state, or I hadn't had a traumatic life experience up until that point. But I know that traumatic experiences and prolonged experiences of psychological turmoil can be conducive to spiritually transformative experiences like the one that Eckhart Tolle had. Tolle, I can never pronounce his surname.
I think it's Tolle, or it's actually Tulle, but it's taken away the two dots there, so it's Tolle now.
Specifying that. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know what caused it.
But do you have a feeling or a sense that, or maybe you don't think that way, but anyway, I can ask the question, that your higher self or your oversoul or whatever you want to call it has or kind of had a plan for you to awaken at that particular point in time, because you were supposed to do this, what you're doing now, instead of what you did before? That there was a plan, so to speak. Is that something you believe?
Not quite like that. I wouldn't describe it quite like that, but I know that I now have a sense of mission to play. I have a sense of mission from that experience. So I did feel this immense sense that I needed to do something with this experience, to be of selfless service towards other people, to help others, which is actually quite a common feature in awakening experiences. But I don't think of it in the sense that a higher level of consciousness or my spirit guides or anything like that wanted me to have this kind of experience. I don't tend to think about spirit guides anyway. I'm not, averse to the idea, but it's just not a way that I think. So yeah, but it definitely left me with a sense of mission. So
before we just leave this personal experience, I think it's very interesting actually, and I think many listeners do as well. I would like to know a little bit more about that lucid dream you had, if you're willing to share, because I heard you talk about this in another interview some point, where you said that it was a lucid dream, as you say, and a lucid dream is a dream where you know that you're dreaming, but you're there and you can change things and act within the dream, so to speak. But I think you have said that you met a number of entities or teachers, maybe you might call them, in the dream. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And they told you things. You asked them, and they told you things. Is that also right? And that's, I mean, I'm of course extremely curious as to what did they tell you? What did you learn from those teachers in that lucid dream?
Well, I can't remember what they said to me, but I know that they were responding with the most eloquent responses regarding what is the meaning of life. That was the question that I was going around asking each individual character in my dream. I was asking them the same question individually: what is the meaning of life? And each of them would give me a very different and very eloquent response. And and I knew intuitively that they were teachers, as you put them, or great thinkers. So I knew that they were, great mathematicians, physicists, philosophers, psychologists. I knew that they were that I was dealing with these kinds of people or characters in my dream. And as I became aware, I realized, I became more and more aware, and I kept asking this question, and I was increasingly more curious as to where these responses were coming from. And I thought to myself, what if these answers are already within me, and then that's when I woke up. But rather than just waking up from the dream, I also woke up to a new way of experiencing life. So it's not like I woke up and I started to think, oh, what happened to me during the dream? What is it that they were telling me, and how can I apply this to my life? Not at all. That was not at all the case. I woke up and I had this experience, this flood of emotion, of devotion, of love. So yeah.
Maybe it wasn't a dream in the conventional sense. Maybe you were somewhere else.
Maybe.
Who knows?
Maybe. And it's so interesting to read up about things like near-death experiences where people encounter these kinds of figures, because there are similarities between my experience perhaps and near-death experiences and DMT, dimethyltryptamine experiences, and that's what I find fascinating, is that no matter what the trigger is or the non-trigger may be, the experience is almost always the same. The experience of awakening, that golden thread that ties all these experiences together, is typically that of a greater sense of consciousness existing in this universe, and of consciousness being primary or fundamental in the universe, rather than something that is created and produced by the brain. And I think if you speak to most people who've had these experiences, they'll tell you the same thing.
What is the brain, do you think? How do you describe the brain? Is it a filter?
I really, if I were to go with any theory, it would be that, for instance, Aldous Huxley put forward, of the brain being a filter, or
William James already in the 1890s, I think.
William James as well, yeah. So yeah, it almost feels as though in those kinds of moments, and again, this is symbolically speaking, it's as though a valve opens up to a greater sense of a greater sense of consciousness, or is able to let more consciousness through in some ways. But I think that's oversimplifying a very, very complex experience as well. So I'm very aware that, what might cause these experiences is perhaps something that we'll never have the answers to. Yeah.
Some people say that like life here on Earth is a feedback loop in a way. I mean, there are other dimensions which we are actually also part of when we're here, but we don't really experience them day to day. But you might have done that in your experience, and the NDEers might experience that when they are near death. But anyway, that there's a feedback loop in the sense that what we experience here in the three-dimensional world is that information, that experience, which we can't have in the non-physical dimensions, is conveyed to those dimensions by way of the brain. And the brain also takes in information from the non-physical realm, which can come in handy sometimes here when we end up in troubles and problems and we don't know where to go and we feel lost. Then we need this information, and then the brain also filters that information down. So it's kind of a back and forth feedback loop all the time. What do you think of that theory?
I mean, it could be totally plausible, but yeah, I'll just say something about you. We're talking about dimensions, and very much my experience. Again, it's my experience, and I don't want to sort of project my own experience onto other people's experience of life. But I very much knew in my own experience that that there's a multidimensionality to reality, and that one can tap into different layers of reality or of conscious experience. Now, of course, that's evident through accessing altered states, but there's very much this. I had very much this sense that the universe or consciousness was composed of different layers that one could access. So, and it's something that is discussed a lot in indigenous cultures,
yes.
in the world, and in different traditions all over the world as well. So what was really cool actually was then to start to read up about these experiences, from a cross-cultural perspective, and just trying to understand the experience better by reading about it. And most texts that I found were, from ancient traditions worldwide, and they all said very similar things to what I had experienced. So it's cool to find yourself in very, so-called not alien civilizations, but ways of thinking that I wouldn't necessarily have encountered before the experience.
Yeah, cool aha experience to see that. Yeah, so let's go into that then. That what happened with your to your career, or how you decided to change your career after that profound experience. You decided to leave the art world and become a psychologist. Was that a self-evident path for you to take at that point, would you say?
Yeah, so it took a while for me to understand that I was going to go into in the direction that I did end up going into. But I knew that I wanted to do something, that I needed to do something with this experience, and that I needed to act in selfless service towards humanity, even if in a small way. But I knew that I needed to do something of the sort. And I realized very quickly that I needed to change things from the inside, from the inside of mainstream psychology, if I wanted to see tangible change within psychiatric systems and the way that they deal with these experiences. So yeah, it sort of started to make sense when I began to read up about these experiences more. And I did my own sort of what I thought was research at the time, as in I would go on Google and type in spiritual awakenings and anything. I could find lots of things that I could relate to, but nothing that I couldn't find any of the science behind it. And I was fascinated to understand, what might have gone on in my brain at that time. And all I could find was, quite unfounded but equally beautiful blog post. But I thought that there was something really missing in what was out there and the information that was out there, and that needed changing. But I also found myself needing community about a year down the line, and I didn't really know where to turn to. And then I found this organization called Assist. They're an American, stands for the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences, I think. And they put me in touch with a group on Facebook, of all places. Mm-hmm. And then I met a large community, a vast community of people who've had similar experiences to mine, not necessarily the exact experience. And I recognized that the experience wasn't always considered blissful. It could also be very terrifying. It could be, bewildering, and sometimes negative. And I thought, wow, I mean, we also need to understand these experiences from a scientific perspective to be able to better help individuals who are having negative experiences of the spiritual type. So yeah, that's sort of where, the whole idea of going into psychology came from. And of course, I mean, now we're starting to see this sort of evolution within scientific systems, within science, with regards to spiritual experiences, through the study of psychedelics, for example, or mindfulness-based interventions. And they're sort of paving the path to better understand mystical experiences as well. But back then, even just 6 years ago, I mean, there wasn't very, very much going on, or at least it wasn't really widely discussed. And I feel like in the last few years, it's been, very much the subject of mainstream talk, spiritual experiences. And
things are happening.
Yeah.
It's also relative, because I mean, you're younger than me, and I remember that these things were actually discussed in some circles back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But I mean, it's much bigger now. You're right. It's much bigger and much more widespread today.
Yeah. No, of course, it's always existed. This sort of form of transpersonal psychology has existed for some time, but I think that it's just reaching the mainstream a lot more now. So it's kind of propelling scientists to want to explore these experiences more, even if they haven't had the experience themselves. So it's sort of a spark of interest that's happening at the moment. Yeah.
And you wrote a paper together with a colleague, David Duke, yeah? Luke or Duke?
David
Luke, yeah. Scientific paper that was published in a peer-reviewed paper, I understand, a couple of years ago. Was it 2021 or?
Yeah, in summer 2021.
Where you had studied people who had these spontaneous spiritual awakenings, as you have experienced yourself. And what were your main conclusions? I know it's a big topic, but if you can just summarize the results and the findings that you came up with there.
Yeah. We found that things like, so first of all, we wanted to understand whether the experience was predominantly considered positive or negative in the short and long terms. We obviously hypothesized that it would be overall positive, but we sort of need to bring out that data in order to inform the systems. And we found that 98% of all individuals who had the experience considered it to be overall a very positive experience in the long term. And the fact that the percentages were even higher in the long term compared to the short term. So I think 90.8% of all individuals in our study considered the experience positive in the short term. So 90.8 versus 98 in the long term. That sort of also indicates that even if the experience is initially negative or a little bit challenging, it's almost always considered positive in the long term. So that's really indicative at how profound and how transformative and life-changing these experiences can be. So we found that. We also found that temporal lobe lability, which they kind of refer to the symptoms that are often found in temporal lobe epilepsy. Mm-hmm. That those were good predictors of the overall experience, i.e., that the stronger the temporal lobe lability symptoms reported, the stronger the spontaneous spiritual awakening typically was. right? So there was a correlation between temporal lobe ability and spontaneous spiritual awakenings, and that there was also a correlation between trait absorption, which refers to the depth to which one's attention or focus is on something without effort or control. So in other words, the level of engrossment in something, that was found to be a predictor of the spontaneous spiritual awakening experience. And we also found that spontaneous spiritual awakenings were overall stronger experiences when compared to all other measured altered states of consciousness, be that through drugs or through other means, through non-drug induced means. So that was also quite telling to how powerful these experiences are. And of course, there were limitations with some of the things that we did. And I would suggest that if anyone's interested in our findings, that they should read the paper to, get the full scope of what we sort of found, and also the limitations and what we should do in the next papers. But the overall findings were very, very telling and very promising.
Mm. So what does positive mean in this context? I mean, you said that the experience was positive for 98% of the respondents in the long run, in the long term. Does that mean does positive here mean something very profound, like they stopped feeling anxiousness about anything? They stopped, they didn't have any fear of death anymore? They didn't suffer anymore? Or was it just like minor improvements, like they were more happy? Or how would they describe this positive effects?
This was through a survey, so it wasn't as, we didn't get as much qualitative data because it was we already had such a vast amount of data that we couldn't. I actually did do interviews with people, but we ended up not using that data. But from the interviews, it was extremely positive in a very transformative way, rather than in a minor way, i.e. people reported, loss of fear of death, loss of anxiety, sort of all the things that I touched on earlier regarding my own experience, and more. So people who might have been able to reconnect with family members after their experience because they were able to feel greater empathy and gain a greater sense of perspective around life, and so on and so forth. So, yeah. But in terms of the 98%, we didn't really, look into what exactly they termed as positive. But what we did also find is that almost all the individuals reported an increased, almost all individuals in our study said that they undertook a sort of holistic or exercise or lifestyle that would encourage them furthermore to experience positive spiritual benefits. So lots of people undertook yoga, meditation, mindfulness. Lots of individuals reported going out in nature much more than before, wanting to protect nature, and so on. So they displayed greater pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors. So, yeah.
Yeah. Many people in the spiritual community talk about the difference between suffering and pain, and that's kind of an interesting concept, I think. And it's very closely related to time, as far as I understand. And I can, as you were referring to initially here, I can intellectually understand a lot of what you're saying and all these awakening features, but I understand also that there is something else to it's something completely different to experience it. Fully in your body and in your whole essence. But anyway, the suffering pain thing is that suffering is something that happens when you are stuck in time, in a way. So, and this applies to all of these people that you have surveyed and interviewed also, as I assume. But when you lose that sense of time, when you're living in the now, in the now moment, in the present, then you can't really suffer. you can have painful experiences, but I mean they pass. Everything passes. So the suffering is about staying in the pain. So to ask you a question, some say that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Would you agree with that?
I think it's easy for people who haven't had extremely traumatic experiences to say that it's, something, it's a choice. And I agree that it is. In some ways it is, because like you say, if you train your brain muscle to be more in the present, to live more in the present is safe, the present is okay. And thus there is a sort of release from being enslaved to whatever is bringing you into that state of sadness or fear. But it might take a lot longer for some than for others,
Well, when I say optional, I don't mean that it's easy to just opt out of it, but technically or philosophically, it is in a way optional. That's what I'm referring to.
I believe so, but also I probably shouldn't comment on this because I don't know enough about the underpinnings of trauma and how it works on the brain. So I'd rather do more work in this area
right.
to understand, what actually happens in the depressed brain and in the traumatized brain. But yeah, I mean, from as far as I know, I would agree with you in that it is something that you can seek relief from as well. So there's hope for those who are having extremely difficult times. There is hope for those people. And that's why these experiences are super powerful, because they can actually give people glimpses at that present moment, at that present state, and thus at least temporarily release them from that state of depression or trauma.
Mm. You mentioned also here that these people that you have surveyed and interviewed, some of them have taken up practices like meditation and yoga and whatnot. So I have a question about that also. There are so many often called New Age practices, and many of them are actually very ancient, like astrology. We talked about astrology before we started this interview, and that's kind of I'm interested in that, and I think it's both very amusing and also very useful, I think. But anyway, what do you think about these New Age practices like tarot, astrology, crystals, perhaps? What have you? I mean, yoga, you mentioned yoga, but that's also a physical practice thing. Numerology, things like that. Are all these in some way, do you think, parts of a non-physical reality that the psyche can tap into? Or are some of them just simply dismissible? I mean, maybe you don't know how to answer that question, but I kind of think it's interesting to hear your opinion about it.
I don't really know. I think certain practices are more evidently connected to these kinds of, awakening experiences. As you said, yoga and meditation, I mean, and breath work, they can quite obviously change the sort of brain chemistry of the practitioner. In terms of crystal healing and tarot, there might be an element of priming there, but I don't know. And I know people who've had very profound experiences with crystal therapy and Reiki. So I don't want to, again, project my own belief system on other people's experience, because I think, even if it were to be down to something like placebo effect, which I'm not saying it necessarily is, but even if it was, I mean, placebo is...
I mean, placebo is spiritual, isn't it?
Spiritual, exactly. So, but no, I mean, I'm much more, in the sense of what I practice, for example, and what I teach as well. I know that actually has an effect on the mind, body, and the soul. I've experienced it myself, but I also understand some of the neurobiological underpinnings of these experiences and how they might change a brain physiognomy and chemistry. So it's much more obvious that those kinds of practices would be conducive to altered states of consciousness. But yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it, on things like astrology and I mean, astrology again is slightly different than crystal therapy.
It is, yeah.
They're all different, and that's the thing. I don't think we should be boxing practices up into one sort of box. I tend to do that too, but I suppose each practice is different and carries itself.
Yeah, I guess so. But I just think it's might be connected to some kind of energy flows that are going on that we don't know enough about.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, but astrology is actually, like I say, it's a bit different because it's actually, I mean, very serious astrologers. They are actually studying this subject very deeply, and they have a lot of deep knowledge about the celestial bodies in the universe, not least, and what they're doing, and it's very philosophical. Actually, it's about as I see it, it's about the qualities of points in space-time, if you will. So different points have different qualities, and they are. I mean, it's not unthinkable. I mean, to me, it's why not? Anything's possible, and I actually think it does work in my life. So I mean, and people Absolutely. Can probably say that that's placebo, and that's just because I want it to work. So I can't prove it, but I feel that it's working fairly well, actually. So.
But that's the thing. It doesn't really matter whether, obviously, it would be interesting to understand how these things work. But if they work to improve people's well-being, then that's wonderful. And who knows? And things like, again, astrology is slightly different, maybe to other practices that are less affected by it, because it's very, we're talking about physics, and we're talking about placements of planets, and so it's very different to say talk about working with rocks and with crystals.
Well, it could all actually boil down to energy flows, but also some skeptics can say that you always end up talking about energies. It's so diffuse, and it is. I know that, but I mean, everything is energy anyway. So I mean, we're not. I mean, matter doesn't even exist.
Or it does. It is energy.
I beg your pardon?
It does exist. It's just energy.
I mean, you can put it like that. Exactly.
I think there's a tendency to sort of place things like, astrology or interdimensional kind of beings or whatever on a pedestal. But actually, the reality that we're living right now, that the fact that we're living on a ball of rock in the middle of the universe, we don't know where we're going, we don't know where we've come from. That to me is fascinating enough. I don't necessarily feel like I need to believe in other things. Like, this reality is the manifestation of it's like the most fantastical thing that you could ever dream up. And so whilst other things are really interesting, I find myself often just engrossed and in complete awe to just what I can see, even to the physical reality around me. And if we believe that all is one, that includes materialism, that includes scientism, even that we sort of often discuss in our Galileo Commission groups. That includes absolutely everything that you can fathom. So I don't think it's a case of separating and sort of one-upping. I'm not saying you're definitely not doing this, but a lot of people tend to do this. There's a sort of a one-upment of, this experience in life is more important than this experience. But actually, I think when you have an awakening, or you realize that everything is equally as important and everything has its place in our lived reality. So
that's very, very wisely put, I must say. Well said. So Jessica, what do you think? Is science compatible with spirituality?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in what way? In every way, maybe.
Or we can use science to better understand spiritual experiences, which is already a start. That would only be to uncover a small aspect of the overall experience, but it's still one aspect. And science has enabled us to look through the telescope quite literally at other worlds, i.e., even things like cosmology or, the universe. We've been able to use science to develop technologies to be able to understand the nature of our universe, the nature of ourselves, of our reality, to a much greater extent. So science is already being used as a form of, as an indirect form of understanding the nature of our reality, the nature of our life, and the nature of where we come from. Whether we like to call it spiritual or not, it is spiritual, because essentially life is, in my opinion, it is fully spiritual. But in terms of science and spirituality being bridged at this moment in time, I mean, I do believe that they're compatible. I think we need to expand our understanding of what science actually means and what it is, in order to encompass a greater sense of what this reality and what this life could be. But that's not to say that we should get rid of the scientific method, which essentially is the underlier of science. It's just about expanding.
It should be possible to use on any subject, even, I mean, the non-physical subjects.
Sorry?
I mean, the scientific method should be able to use to apply on anything, even the non-physical, shouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course, it's very difficult. I mean, you know, you could argue that obviously with scientific progression, we have been able to see things that we could not see with our five senses, with our two eyes. So in many ways, it has uncovered things that would have been considered metaphysical before, like even things like infrared or ultraviolet lights that we weren't able to see with our eyes, or using neuroimaging to better understand the brain and so on. In many ways, we're using science to understand things that would have been considered back in the day as sort of, way out there.
Not to speak about quantum physics, of course.
Quantum physics. But it's difficult to develop methods to be able to understand things that we can't see already when we fathom, and that a lot of people haven't experienced. So I think we need to be patient with science. But also, yes, of course, I mean, there's this big issue that there is an underlying scientism that taking over or has taken over science, in that scientists come often with a presumption of what they think the universe already is, i.e. that it is there is an underlying materialism to it, rather than an underlying consciousness. And so that automatically shifts the dialogue or the conversation around science, and it brings in a sort of bias towards what our existence really is and what the findings might indicate. So
I've interviewed quite a few people about these things over the course of the last 2 years, and Pim van Lommel, who's written this study on near-death experiences, you know about him, of course. He was also on the show, and he said that he thought that in this context that experiential evidence must at some point be considered equal to physical or measurable, traditionally measurable evidence, if you see what I mean. So experiential, because we experience, consciousness is about experiencing, it's about qualia, it's about being a human and experiencing things, and it can be feelings or it can be thoughts or whatever, and it's not measurable in our conventional Western sense, but that has to be at some point considered equal to measurable evidence. And that's, if that happens, then we would cross the threshold probably in this development.
Phenomenology is essential, and that's why I undertook the research that I did undertake, and that I am undertaking currently with the EPRC. And it is so important to get a first-person perspective on certain experience, on all experience of life, actually, because essentially, this is a tool. We have tools. We have our five senses. We have our eyes. We have our, inner experience that needs to come out. And we need to share stories in order to better understand, who we are as a species. And I totally agree that phenomenology, first person subjective experience is extremely important for the science and for the progress of our understanding on these experiences within science.
What's your feeling here? Are we on the cusp of tearing down this wall between science and spirituality that was raised 300 years ago or so, 400 years ago, when the church and scientists split? Are we on the cusp of taking back the child into the bathwater, the baby into the bathwater that we threw out back in those days?
Yeah, I mean, I think with things like psychedelic research that's being undertaken at, some of the leading universities in the world, and also research on contemplative practices, and there's lots of funding now for, not lots, but there are quite big bodies of funding that are being put into trying to understand the nature of consciousness. So that all of these things, I think, are enabling for the joining of science and spirituality to take place at a much more rapid rate. So yes, I think things are changing now. I think we are going through a paradigm shift within the worlds of science and within the worlds of spirituality as well. So we're starting to, join them.
So what's in your research pipeline right now?
So I'm currently undertaking research with the EPRC in order to better understand whether these experiences might occur more frequently within general populations than we originally thought, and with a special focus on spiritual contemplative practices. So mindfulness interventions, meditation, yoga, and breath work, and other. So that's sort of what I'm working on at the moment. And then I have many dreams of what projects I would like to undertake in the future, but that'll be for another podcast, maybe.
You don't want to mention one of those dreams, perhaps?
What would be wonderful would be to find a way to use neuroimaging to better understand the experience of spontaneous awakenings. However, the fact that spontaneous awakenings are spontaneous makes it very difficult to get people. You can't induce a spontaneous awakening, in other words. So I'm trying to find a way around that.
Maybe planned spontaneous awakenings?
Spontaneous awakenings, definitely. No, I mean, I think I'll keep those future ideas for another podcast, because I think they're close to being brewed in my mind.
Yeah. Well, sure. I'd love to have you back, of course, on this show. So I'm looking forward to that, to our next chat. Are you also looking into psychedelics? You mentioned psychedelics and their impact and effect on people's possible awakenings. Is that something that you're looking into as well?
I mean, I'm looking into them indirectly. So I'm mostly interested in spontaneous awakenings that are not induced through psychedelics, even though psychedelic mystical experiences and awakenings are extremely interesting and important. But my area is slightly different. My area of expertise of interest is slightly different. But of course, it would be great to work with psychedelic groups in order to sort of better understand the mystical experiences that emerge from psychedelic experiences. So I'm absolutely pro that. But yeah, it's mostly been indirect until now.
Yeah. Okay. Jessica, now where can people find you if they want to know more about you and your work and research?
Well, I don't have a website yet, still.
Coming.
But yes, it's up and coming. They can contact me on my email address, which you'll probably be able to put on a link somewhere.
Yeah, I'll put links in the description box, of course. Yeah.
First name and surname at gmail.com. So jessicacorneille@gmail.com. Get in touch if you want to be part of any future research, or if you would like to share your experience with me. And yeah, that's probably the best way you can find me, or on LinkedIn.
Okay. Jessica Corneille, it's been a joy speaking with you, and an education also today. And good luck with all your fantastic work and research in the future. I'm looking forward to following you on this path. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
If you like this video and other interviews and talks on Mind the Shift, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate all the support. And you can follow Mind the Shift on Facebook and Instagram. And you can follow me, Anders Bolling, on all the main social media and also on medium.com. Thank you.